Hey, welcome to an episode of InRange. A while back, now a couple weeks ago, we started doing a 101 series,
Yep.
and we talked about red dots with magnifiers versus LPVOs. And so in the continuation of 101, another one that's a really common question are manual safeties, double action, single action, Glock style safe action safeties, and what's the best thing for carry for self-defense purposes, right?
Yep.
So you had a lot of experience in a self-defense, or what were you doing? A security training?
Yeah, I was running Arizona Armed Guard qualifications for a few years, about 10 years ago.
And that's like a legally prescribed course of fire?
Yeah, it's a state minimum training standard for armed security guards that's regulated by the Department of Public Safety in Arizona. It's a 50-round course of fire. So typically, you'd have 50 rounds for practice and 50 rounds for the qualification course to get people through it so they could get certified to keep carrying their gun on the job.
And you couldn't dictate what firearms they used, so they pretty much brought everything, yeah?
Everything from like the cheapest thing imaginable to for corporate security guys, like, pretty nice stuff.
Yeah, I can imagine you probably even saw revolvers.
Yes, in fact, the qual course is based around being able to use a revolver.
That's interesting, considering the time and era we're in. That's not to say that revolvers are useless, but in the modern day, they're a niche application.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're not really addressing that today, although we have one on the table for historical purposes, which I'll get into. But I think the first thing that we should do in a 101 is the very basics. What are the different actions? Is that fair?
Sure.
So one of the first ones we want to talk about, these are all cleared already, by the way, but this is a 1911, which is a single action. And a single action means that, now that we're clear, the hammer has to be cocked, and pressing the trigger performs one action. And that single action is to drop the hammer. That's it. So single action means the trigger drops the hammer. And if you're carrying a 1911, the way to typically carry that is what's called cocked and locked, which is actually the safest way, where the hammer is cocked, but the safety is applied manually. And at that point, even if the grip safety is depressed, the gun won't fire, right? So you have to sweep that safety off for that single action press of the trigger to drop the hammer. Now, the alternative to that is double action, which we have a Beretta to represent that, also clear. Double action is when we have dropped the hammer to carry it quote unquote safely with the hammer down, but pressing the trigger does two things. It cocks the hammer and fires the gun. So double action is two actions with one trigger press, right?
Yeah.
And then we get into the weirder space of like the Glock safe action, in which there is no manual safety on the gun itself. There is a dingus on the trigger, and unless you're pressing the trigger and the dingus, it won't fire. But it's not exactly single action, because pressing the trigger actually pulls the striker a little further back before it'll fire.
Right. In theory, if the striker dropped even without the firing pin block in the way, it wouldn't necessarily have the energy to set off a primer if it wasn't cocked the rest of the way first.
Right, so that's a safety feature, and that's why they call it the safe action, right?
Right.
Now, Glock receives a lot of attention for being kind of, when I think of people bringing the safe action to the market, that type of trigger, don't most people think Glock?
Yes.
Well, it was happening in the 1880s. First guys to do this was Ivor Johnson. This is a double action revolver, which means that you press the trigger and it cycles and fires, does two things, cocks the hammer and fires the gun in one press of the trigger. But guess what? It's got the dingus.
Split trigger right there.
Yep, so they did that a long time ago. So that's not a Glock thing. They just brought it into modernity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we see the Glock style safe action trigger on very current modern guns. This is the new Smith & Wesson Bodyguard 2, and it has that same thing, the dingus, and a trigger that can't be fired unless you press it all together at the same time. And this can be acquired with both a manual external safety or just the safe action trigger. Or we see a relatively modern carry pistol. This is the Walther CCP, where it has a manual safety right here, you can see. And if the safety is up, meaning engaged, the trigger's dead. And you have to disengage the safety for it to fire. Now, there's a lot going on here. So I think when we hear people talk about what to carry, most people now talk about this style safe action trigger and tend to avoid manual safeties on the gun.
Right, and the major reason for that, and the reason why Glock took over the market starting in the '80s with the safe action pistol is that double action, single action guns like your Beretta there that can have two different states. It can be double action, or as if the slide was cycled, the hammer is going to be back, and that creates two different trigger pulls.
Right. So double action. This is a long, heavy press. And then if it fires, because it's got live ammunition, the slide cycles, and now the hammer's cocked, and now it's a short trigger reset and a light trigger press. Right. So you have two different presses for your second. You have a different weight for your first shot from your second shot.
And you potentially have a decocker and or a combination decocker safety on those designs, which those were the prevalent designs prior to Glock coming on the market with the safe action pistol. Is that for agency training, where you have to train a lot of people in a short period of time to make acceptable hits with a minimal amount of ammunition, the safe action pistol with a consistent trigger pull and no manual controls just shortcuts the whole process.
So what that means there is that when the gun's loaded and the striker is partially cocked, the first trigger press is, let's say, 5 pounds. Mm-hmm. It's like, or 5.5. It cycles. The second trigger press is 5.5 pounds. The third trigger press is 5.5 pounds.
Right, and you don't have to worry about decocking it. You don't have to worry about turning off a safety. So it makes it much more simple to train a lot of people all at the same time, because if the gun's loaded, the gun's loaded. You don't have to consider different ready conditions.
Like what's with this, if I put ammunition in it and cycle the gun, but I'm not ready to fire and want to holster it, this might have a decocker, which this one does, but not all of them do. And you may have to actually do this thing where you press the trigger and carefully lower the hammer, which, by the way, sometimes slips and goes off. Not a good thing. But the bigger and most important part is this first trigger press is, let's say, 8 pounds. And then it cycles. And the second one might even be 4 pounds. Like half the weight required to fire that second round. And in a rush, as you bring this up and press hard to get that first round off, and then it cycles, and then you do something in a rush to fire the second shot, you can very easily change or transition.
It is quite common to see an exaggerated first low left shot for a right-handed shooter with a double action gun, and then every single action shot to start punching out the center. And the further you are away from the target, more exaggerated that becomes. On a number of occasions, running those qualification courses, and again, these are people, they don't have a lot of income. They're working just above a minimum wage job for most of them. They don't have a lot of money to train. So if they were using a DASA gun, it was quite often we'd see the qual scores lower, and sometimes they wouldn't even qualify. But if they rented a Glock or other striker-fired pistol from the host range we were running class at, their qual score would immediately go up.
Is that because the first shot went wild and the second one or third one cleaned it up?
Some of that, and also sometimes they'd forget to turn their safety off. They'd forget to, particularly if it was a combination safety decocker, drilling into them to decock before holstering was also a big challenge too, because holstering a single action trigger pull without a safety applied is not safe.
This is very light. It could easily go off in that process.
Yep. So it was a lot more work, and few of the people who had those DASA guns were willing to put in the time and energy to master the gun.
So I'm going to say some stuff in this video, this 101, that's probably going to get angry comments, as they always do. But I'm going to go ahead and go with DASA is probably the last and worst choice you might make.
I would generally agree for people who are the typical average gun owner and shooter that are not going to put in the time to master it.
I'm not going to say you can't master this. That's not my point. Mm-hmm. But like for someone who's buying their first gun for self-defense, DASA might be your worst possible choice.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
So I'm going to put that to the side. Let's not do that. Now, this is an old revolver, but even current J-frames are just DA. So it's the same press per firing. However, it's heavy. Here, it's like a staple gun. Mm-hmm. This would still be better than DASA because it's at least the same trigger each time.
Right. And in the case of a revolver, you don't have to worry about a manual safety.
No, but even if it was just a DA semi-auto, if it's the same press each time, at least you're used to 8 pounds each time.
Yep.
Instead of 8 and then 4. Mm-hmm. But I still would say that this is not really kind of optimal anymore.
No.
Would you agree with that?
I would agree.
Okay. So now we're putting DASA, bottom of the charts. Straight DA, one step better. The next step better, and if you disagree with any of this, let me know. The next step of things that I would try not to do is single action with manual safety. That's 1911. Now, first of all, if you're carrying this in open carry, it looks scary to people that don't know that, but that doesn't matter, but it does look kind of weird. That said, it does have a light trigger press for every time you cycle the gun.
And that's why we're seeing a renaissance of 1911 and 2011 style guns, is because the trigger pull is so nice and so consistent on them.
Which matters in competition. And it matters for accuracy. But in stress, and when things are going wrong fast, is a light trigger press necessarily the best answer?
Well, Staccato seems to be selling law enforcement agencies on that.
And that does. What do you think is from what you've seen? This is us talking.
I think a single action gun is more of a proficient expert's weapon.
I would agree with that.
And in part because I've seen people miss safeties on the draw. They're gripping the gun in such a way they accidentally reactivate the safety under recoil.
Interesting.
So it's a technique thing where you need to make sure that you're riding the safety down, or in the event that you don't have thumbs big enough to do that, that your hands are free and clear and you're not reactivating it under recoil. And also being conscious of reapplying the safety as you pivot back down to go in the holster. So there's more thought process involved. It's easier to shoot accurately with a single action trigger pull, but from a basic self-defense perspective, I think for most people, it's introducing variables that they don't need to worry about.
Yeah, so on that, so what we're talking about here is when this comes out to fire, you got to sweep that off, and you got to remember to sweep it off. You also have to remember to put it back on before you're reholstering, or you're putting a gun in your holster that could go off. But additionally, I'm going to add to this, the lightness of this trigger is probably lighter than is necessary for someone, is actually probably a little unsafe for someone who hasn't trained a lot, because you might get an errant round.
Yeah, so there's something to consider too, is inexperienced shooters, they under the excitement or trying to shoot too fast, not being conscious of how the trigger actually works, it's easier to unintentionally double or triple with a single action trigger than you would with a safe action trigger.
So on our list of things to do, this would be our third probably shouldn't do option. So then we get to a modern gun that has a little heavier trigger than a single action, because it's got that striker that it's got to be dragged back to fire. But it does have a manual external safety. Now, I like this gun, and I've talked about it in the past and like it. But to me, the deficiency of the CCP, if there is one to be had, is that manual safety. And I think you were just touching on that.
Right.
Which is, when this comes out under stress, you have to remember to sweep that off. And if you don't, you're just sitting there with a dead trigger.
And also the thing to consider with a lot of the compact carry guns that have manual safeties is the manual safety is pretty small. If you look at the manual safety on things like a P365 or a Smith & Wesson Shield, it's even smaller than the one on that.
Yeah, it's really like a little nubbin or something.
Right.
Yep.
So will you be able to consistently actuate that under stress? Well, I'm not sure. Where I think the manual safeties make sense is if you're using a non-traditional carry method, like you're carrying it in a bag off-body carry style, which, there's reasons people do that. I don't generally advocate for it. But if you're not carrying it in a holster, a manual safety is preferred.
But then we're getting into a different topic, right? But what you're talking about is if you're carrying it in any way in which the trigger is exposed,
yes,
you need a manual safety.
Yes.
Unless it's a very heavy DA trigger, but even then, that's not a good idea.
Right.
Okay, so here's the next one. We're going to be like, I don't think you or I agree on. I would not want a manual external safety if I could avoid it.
I would agree. I don't like manual safeties.
Which we have the Glock now and this Bodyguard 2.0. And the reason the Bodyguard 2.0 just came out, I'm not trying to promote this as much as talk about it as a very recent addition to the CCW market. You can get this with the safe action trigger or the manual safety, meaning an external safety. And I very intentionally got the safe action trigger. And it was for the reasons you discussed and we've had in our own practice and training. That is just one more thing to go wrong.
Yeah, I agree. And training a whole lot of people over those few years, I saw manual safeties accidentally get activated.
While firing?
While firing pretty regularly.
Wow.
And actually, the bigger your hands are with particularly the tinier the gun is, the easier that is to do.
Yep. And so what this does is, of course, your finger has to be in the trigger, on the trigger. It has to press both for it to fire. Additionally, that dingus is drop safety issue. The inertia of the gun hitting the ground with a trigger, especially a heavy trigger, could cause the trigger to bounce and fire. But when it has that piece in it, that prevents the trigger from being able to be pressed even by the inertia of striking the ground, because it prevents the trigger from being pulled unless both are.
Right.
Which is when we get into the weird issue going on with some of the SIGs right now. Potentially. Yep. Which they're trying to mitigate or have mitigated or whatever. But that little dingus is what prevents that.
Yeah, the industry best practices show that everyone doing a striker-fired pistol, with one notable exception, are doing it with a split trigger safety.
Yep. And we think of the Glock as being really the progenitor of that. So it sounds like we're on the same page. If I'm going to have a concealed carry gun, or an open carry gun for that matter, for practical self-defense purposes, I'm looking for something without a manual safety, striker fired, with a safe action trigger.
I would agree that something in that classification should be everyone's first pistol, and you'll know when you've graduated past that with your training to try something else.
But when you're training for practical purposes, there's no reason to make it harder on yourself. What you really want to cheat. You want the easiest gun that you can fire the most reliably all the time.
Correct.
And that's that, which is why Glock took the world, right?
Yep. And now basically everyone else is doing some sort of clone, copy, or derivative of the striker-fired safe action pistol.
Unless they're doing some weird exception because they're trying to differentiate themselves and then actually getting in trouble doing it in the process.
Right.
Yeah. So, I guess that's our summary. Is that a 101 right there?
Yep. I mean, there's a reason the phrase "just buy a Glock 19" exists.
Right. Although there's lots of options that aren't necessarily that provide the same kind of functions, right? Like a VP9, a Glock, this bodyguard.
Yeah. Pick your striker-fired 9mm of your choice. Generally.
Well, I went with 380, but hey.
Well, I mean, the reason most people would go with, like, say, the medium size 9mm start would be shootability and ammo cost.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. That's a different topic for a different day. The smaller the gun gets, the harder it is to use.
Correct.
So if it's your only gun and you want to conceal it and you have your permit if you need one, go with the largest thing you're willing to carry that has this type of functionality.
Yep.
Reasonable?
Yep, reasonable.
All right. Hopefully that helps a lot of people out there that are now looking at getting their first pistol, whether it's concealed carry or not. And hopefully we laid out the reasons in a very distinct and clear way why we prefer this and why we think this is better. Now, obviously some of you out there are going to think that DA is the answer for you and you're amazing with a DA and I tip my hat to you. But to someone who's just starting out, it's not the right call.
No, imagine yourself as the person who's going to shoot 500 rounds or less in a year, and how much time you have available to actually practice and dry fire, and think about what the easiest thing to use would be.
Absolutely. And when it comes to times and stress, you want nothing to think about except what you're dealing with at the moment, even if that's just on the clock.
Yep.
So hopefully you found this to be educational and maybe entertaining, but at least informational and helping you make decisions for yourself. And hopefully now you have a clear understanding of what all these different types of actions are in a very clear and distinct way. And if you do, consider supporting us. Patreon.com/InRangeTV. The reason we can do this, have these guns here to talk to you about it and do this type of educational content is because this is a demonetized channel supported by viewers like you. Patreon.com/InRangeTV. Stay tuned and look forward to more 101 practical shooting tips and videos coming soon.